The past doesn't get erased, but it can be faced. That is the first truth this woman had to grapple with. For 20 years she lived in the shadow of something she couldn't fully understand. Her life was defined by an absence, her mother, gone from her first breath, and by a mystery she wasn't allowed to touch. But time has a way of catching up with silence. Sooner or later, every wound that's buried finds its way to the surface. And for her, facing that past meant looking directly into the eyes of the man responsible for it. The truth hurts, but it also sets us free. She didn't grow up with answers. She had to build her identity without a full picture of where she came from. Meeting her father wasn't about reconciliation. It was about clarity. She needed to know what kind of man he was. She needed to see him not as a figure from a nightmare, but as a human being who made an irreversible choice. That confrontation, painful as it was the beginning of her freedom, because you can't heal from what you're still hiding from. Forgiveness for her didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing. It didn't even mean rebuilding a relationship. What it meant was releasing herself from the prison of rage and confusion. Carrying hate for someone who hurt you so deeply can feel like justice, but over time it turns into a burden. She didn't forgive to make him feel better. She forgave so she could finally breathe. There's a cost to silence. When wounds go unacknowledged, they define you in quiet, corrosive ways. She knew that if she didn't take control of her story, the pain would keep writing it for her. Meeting him was a way of saying, "This is my life now, and I choose what to carry forward." She didn't want her mother's absence to be the loudest voice in her life anymore. She wanted to step out of the shadow of what was taken from her and begin creating something new. Pain runs deep, and it can pass from one generation to the next, but so can strength. The same blood that came from someone who hurt her also came from someone who gave her life, and within her was a strength that couldn't be broken, not by abandonment, not by violence, and not by fear. That strength, though invisible for years, showed up the moment she decided to stop running and start asking the hard questions. The meeting wasn't magical. It wasn't tearful and warm. It was raw, awkward, even cold. But it was honest, and sometimes honesty is the most healing thing we can offer ourselves. She wasn't there to comfort him. She wasn't there to make peace with the past. She was there to face it, and that in itself was the beginning of peace. In the end, she realized something profound. She is not the worst thing that ever happened to her. Her story is not just about loss. It's about courage. It's about choice. She met the man who created her and destroyed her mother, not because she had to, but because she refused to live another day in the dark. That act doesn't erase the past, but it reshapes the future. And that kind of healing is powerful. It doesn't fix what was broken, but it gives her the power to rise, to grow, and to live on her own terms. The truth hurts, but it also sets us free. For her, the truth was something heavy and complicated, something always lingering at the edge of her life. She had been told pieces of it in hushed tones, overheard fragments in arguments, and sensed its weight in the silence that followed questions. There's a particular ache that comes with growing up not knowing the full story of your own origin. She carried that ache into adulthood, unsure whether facing the truth would shatter her or save her. But eventually, she decided she needed to know, even if it broke her, because not knowing was its own kind of pain. Truth doesn't arrive gently. It can come like a storm, wrecking everything that seemed steady. That's what happened when she sat across from the man who had taken her mother's life. It wasn't just the facts of what he did. It was seeing the face of someone she had imagined 1,000 ways. He wasn't the monster she built in her mind, nor was he a man seeking redemption. He was complicated, and that complication was perhaps the hardest truth of all. She wanted to hate him, and part of her did. But another part of her, deep and unsettling, wanted to understand him, not to excuse, but to finally put a name and a shape to the story she'd been living in. Hearing the truth from him was like being handed something sharp. His words didn't offer comfort. He didn't beg for forgiveness or cry. He just spoke plainly, admitting what he had done. That plainness was unbearable in its own way. It forced her to absorb the reality of what had happened, no longer hidden behind court documents or whispered stories. And while it hurt more than she could describe, there was something strangely clarifying about it. Painful as it was, it felt like the first time she was being trusted with her own life story. The truth also brought with it an uncomfortable question: what now? Knowing didn't fix anything. It didn't restore the mother she never knew, nor erase the years she spent wondering, but it gave her the foundation to make her own decisions. No more guessing, no more filling in the blanks. Now she could choose with full knowledge how she wanted to move forward. That choice was everything, because when you're born from violence, the temptation is to let that violence define you. But she saw that she had another option, to define herself, even with the truth in hand. There were no tidy answers in their conversation. She didn't leave with closure, because closure is a myth. What she left with was something more useful: clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't come easy, the kind that only emerges after walking through fire. And, as painful as it was, she saw that the truth had finally given her permission to grieve properly, for her mother, for the life she didn't get, and even for the father she would never fully understand. In many ways, the truth reopened old wounds, but it also allowed them to heal correctly. She no longer had to hold on to anger like armor. She could let it go, little by little, because now she knew what she was healing from. She wasn't trapped in the fog of unanswered questions anymore, and that made her feel stronger, even in her sadness. There's power in knowing, even if the knowledge breaks your heart, because from that broken place, something new can begin to grow. So yes, the truth hurt her, but it also freed her. It gave her back the narrative of her life. No longer was she the girl with the unanswered past. She was a woman who had faced it head on, not for anyone else's peace, but for her own. And though the road ahead would still be hard, she now walked it with her eyes open, her voice clear, and her strength rooted not in what she had lost, but in everything she had survived. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. She knew that from the beginning. Forgiveness, in her case, was not about pretending the past hadn't happened or trying to erase the pain. It wasn't about making peace with the man who had shattered her family. It was about choosing not to carry the weight of his actions for the rest of her life. Forgiveness was a way of setting herself free, not him. She had spent years being angry without fully understanding who she was angry at. Letting go of that rage didn't mean she approved of what he did. It simply meant she no longer wanted his choices to define her. She struggled with the idea of what forgiveness would look like in this situation. People often talked about it as a gentle act, something noble and selfless, but for her it felt more like survival. Carrying hate was exhausting. It bled into everything. It shaped how she trusted, how she loved, how she saw herself. She didn't want to be a person defined by what someone else had done. She wanted to be free, not to forget, but to live without bitterness eating away at her. That decision took years to even consider. It didn't come from softness, it came from strength. Letting go of anger didn't mean letting go of boundaries. She still didn't want a relationship with him. She didn't feel obligated to offer him anything. What she offered herself, though, was the permission to move forward. She chose not to hold on to the poison of resentment. She realized that holding on didn't hurt him, it hurt her. He had already taken enough. The one thing she had control over now was whether or not she let his choices control her from the inside. Forgiveness for her meant saying, "You don't get to live in my head or my heart anymore." There were moments where the weight of what she was doing hit her all over again. She'd see photos of her mother, or hear stories of the kind of person she was, and the rage would return, raw and full. It was during those moments that she had to remind herself that forgiveness wasn't a one-time act. It was a choice she had to keep making, especially when the pain resurfaced. Some days she chose it with ease, other days it felt like a betrayal, but over time she began to understand that healing doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. It means making peace with the fact that it never will be. She often wondered how her mother would feel about what she'd done. Would she understand? Would she be proud? These were questions that would never have answers, but they still mattered. The only thing she knew for certain was that her mother wouldn't want her life to be defined by loss. She believed her mother would want her to live, to love, to be whole, and that belief gave her the strength to keep choosing herself over and over again. Even though she had met him, listened to him, and forgiven him in her own way, the wound didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer open and raw. It was a scar now, something that marked her but didn't control her. She had made peace not with him, but with herself. She had faced the darkest part of her past, and had chosen to walk forward, not unscathed, but unbroken. In the end, forgiveness became her quiet form of rebellion. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was personal, powerful, and real. It was the way she reclaimed her story, not by forgetting what had been done, but by refusing to let it dictate who she would become. And in that decision she found something that had been missing for far too long, her own voice, clear and strong, telling a story no longer rooted in tragedy, but in choice. The wound that isn't acknowledged becomes the scar that defines you. For years she carried a wound she didn't have the words for. People around her tiptoed around the truth, feeding her bits of information in broken pieces. She could feel something missing in the way people looked at her, the awkward pauses when her mother's name was mentioned, the vague answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. And so she built a story from silence, but silence has a way of turning into shame. She learned early on not to ask too many questions, not to dig too deep into her own pain, because the truth scared everyone else more than it scared her. But pain doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It finds other ways to show itself. In her case, it showed up in anxiety, in anger she couldn't explain, in relationships she couldn't hold on to. It showed up in dreams where her mother's face was a blur, and in the ache of not knowing what part of her was inherited and what part was just shaped by loss. Every unanswered question added another layer to the scar. She didn't know how deeply the past was affecting her until she started imagining a life where she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She realized the only way to stop the past from defining her was to confront it. That meant going to the source. Meeting him was the beginning of that confrontation. She didn't know what she expected. Apologies, explanations, maybe even denial. What she found instead was a man who didn't offer much, but whose very presence forced her to see that the story of her life was no longer just an empty outline. It had substance now, it had detail, and even though those details hurt, they gave her something solid to push against, something real. There was no dramatic moment of healing, there was no sudden peace. What there was instead was discomfort and then clarity. She finally understood that avoiding the wound hadn't protected her, it had only made it deeper. Acknowledging it didn't erase the pain, but it gave her a sense of control she had never had. She could name the hurt now, she could trace its shape, and in doing that, she began to separate it from who she was. The wound wasn't her identity, it was something that happened to her, not the sum of her being. People often think strength is about pretending you're not hurt, but she learned it's the opposite. Real strength is found in the moment you say, "This did happen, it did hurt, and I'm still here." She stopped blaming herself for not being over it, and started giving herself permission to feel everything: grief, confusion, even moments of compassion she didn't expect. She wasn't looking for permission anymore. She was reclaiming her story, one painful truth at a time. That scar will always be a part of her. It doesn't fade completely. It shows itself in unexpected ways, at family gatherings, in the quiet after hard conversations, in the mirror when she wonders who she looks like. But now it's not a source of shame, it's a reminder, not of what was lost, but of what she chose to face, of the courage it took to walk into a room with the man who took so much from her and still walk out with her dignity intact. And so, the scar remains, but it no longer defines her. What defines her now is the fact that she refused to let silence shape her life. She faced what others ran from. She acknowledged the wound, gave it a name, gave it space, and in doing so, gave herself a future not dictated by fear or avoidance, but by truth and resilience. And that, more than anything, is the legacy she now carries forward. Pain is inherited, but so is strength. She didn't ask to be born into a story marked by tragedy. From the very beginning, there was a shadow over her life, one that she couldn't see clearly, but could always feel. The loss of her mother wasn't just a missing person. It was a missing history, a missing presence, a missing sense of origin. And though no one ever said it outright, she grew up knowing that there was something about her story that made people uncomfortable. That discomfort was passed down in silence, in glances, in the way people avoided her eyes when the past came up. Even without the full truth, pain has a way of finding its way into your body, your thoughts, your relationships. She carried a weight she didn't understand, one that made her question whether she deserved love, whether she was somehow marked by what had happened before she even had a chance to live. Sometimes pain doesn't show up as tears or screams. It shows up as numbness, as distance, as the inability to trust anything good. She found herself wondering if her life was destined to repeat the chaos it came from. Was she doomed to carry the same destruction forward? But somewhere inside her there was another force, one quieter but just as real. It was the strength she didn't know she had, the strength to keep going even without clarity, the strength to ask questions when it would have been easier to pretend, the strength to meet the man responsible for everything she lost and still hold her head high. That strength wasn't taught to her directly. It was something she inherited, not from him, but from her mother, a strength passed down in blood, in spirit, in the determination to live a life not defined by what others had done. When she met him, she expected to feel powerless. But she didn't. She felt steady, grounded in something bigger than the fear. He had taken so much from her, but he hadn't taken her. She realized then that the pain he caused might be part of her story, but it didn't have to be the center of it. She could choose to take the strength she had found and build something new. She didn't have to repeat the cycle. She didn't have to be angry forever. She could carry what hurt without letting it lead. This understanding didn't come all at once. It unfolded over time, through conversations, through therapy, through long nights filled with doubt. But through it all, she began to see herself not as broken, but as forged. Her strength wasn't the kind you brag about. It was the quiet kind, the kind that keeps showing up even when no one's watching. And the more she leaned into that strength, the more she realized it had always been there, waiting for her to trust it. She started to see that her story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. Yes, pain had been passed down to her, but she had stopped it from going any further. She made different choices. She broke patterns. She looked pain in the face and refused to be defined by it. That's what strength really is, not the absence of hurt, but the refusal to surrender to it. She turned inherited pain into a different legacy, one of courage, one of grace, one of conscious healing. And now, when she thinks about her mother, she doesn't just think of loss. She thinks of the strength she carries that could only have come from her. She thinks of the way she stood in the face of the man who destroyed their family and still walked away with her integrity. The pain didn't end with her, but it changed with her, and in that change she found something powerful, proof that pain can be passed down, yes, but so can resilience, and that resilience is what she chooses to carry forward. Closure isn't always clean. She learned that the hard way. Growing up with a blank space where her mother's story should have been, she had imagined that meeting the man responsible would offer some kind of release, some sharp moment of understanding that would allow her to move on. But reality didn't arrive with clarity. It arrived in fragments, in tension, in moments of silence too loud to ignore. Sitting across from him didn't bring the comfort of answers. Instead, it brought more questions, the kind that didn't have neat or fair endings. She didn't cry when she saw him. She didn't scream. The moment felt surreal, like a scene she had watched play out in her mind too many times to believe it was real. His face didn't match her expectations. He looked older, smaller, more ordinary than the figure she had built in her head, and in that ordinariness she found something unsettling. He was human, not a monster, not a symbol of evil, just a man. A man who had done something unforgivable that made it harder, not easier. He didn't offer much, no tearful apology, no deep explanation, just a quiet presence and a few sentences that neither justified nor erased what he had done. She sat there taking in his words, not because they gave her anything, but because she needed to hear them for herself. She needed to know that she had faced him, not for his sake, but for her own. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken from her, the right to choose how her story would be remembered. Closure, she realized, wasn't a moment, it was a process, and sometimes it looked like walking away still angry, still hurt, but at least no longer confused. Sometimes it meant accepting that some people will never give you what you need, and that peace has to come from within. She had spent years imagining what she would say to him, how she would feel, what kind of ending this would bring. None of it happened the way she imagined, but in that imperfect reality there was truth. She walked out of that room without the resolution she thought she needed, but she walked out with something else, control. The meeting didn't fix her, but it reminded her that she was no longer a child defined by loss. She was a woman who had chosen to stand in front of the past and not flinch, and that choice gave her more than closure. It gave her power. The power to move forward without needing anyone else's permission, the power to write the next chapter on her terms. In the days that followed, she felt everything: relief, anger, sadness, confusion. All of it came in waves, sometimes crashing, sometimes gentle, but she let it come. She didn't try to force peace or deny the pain. She let the messiness be part of the healing, because healing, like closure, isn't clean. It's raw, it's unpredictable, and it's real, and real healing doesn't demand perfection. It just asks for honesty. Now, when she looks back, she sees that moment not as an ending, but as a beginning, a turning point. Closure didn't come in the form of forgiveness or understanding. It came in the form of courage, the courage to face the man who changed her life forever, the courage to feel everything and still keep going, and the courage to let the story continue, not with a perfect ending, but with a powerful new beginning. She used to believe that her life would always be defined by one terrible moment. The story of her father taking her mother's life wasn't just a tragedy. It was a label, a permanent shadow she carried whether she talked about it or not. People looked at her differently when they learned the truth. Some with pity, others with curiosity, but none of it felt like understanding. That single event became the lens through which everyone saw her, and for a long time it was how she saw herself too, like she was forever tied to the worst thing that had ever happened to her. But identity is more than a headline. She learned that slowly, through moments of clarity that followed years of silence. She began to question the idea that pain was the only part of her that mattered. Yes, it had shaped her, but it hadn't destroyed her. She had survived, and more than that, she had grown. The person she was becoming had depth, softness, anger, compassion, and grit. All of it was real. All of it mattered. Her past wasn't the only thing that defined her. It was just one part of a much larger, more complicated truth. She started to reclaim her story, not by forgetting what happened, but by expanding it. She stopped letting other people's discomfort dictate how much of herself she was allowed to show. She talked about the pain when she needed to, but she also talked about her joy, her dreams, her resilience. She began to understand that her identity didn't have to be built around survival alone. It could also include hope, hope that she could become something more, hope that life could be more than just a reaction to what had been taken from her. There were still hard days, days when the weight of it all sat on her chest and refused to move, days when she felt like the little girl left behind. But even then, she reminded herself that those feelings were part of the process, not the whole of who she was. She gave herself grace, knowing that healing isn't linear and that growth sometimes looks like simply continuing to show up for herself, even when it's hard. Each time she chose to keep going, she proved that she was more than her history. She was more than that one day, that one act, that one loss. It wasn't about denying the truth. It was about refusing to let it be the only truth. She began to write new chapters, ones that had nothing to do with violence or trauma. She built friendships, explored her creativity, made choices for her future based on what she wanted, not what she feared. In those moments, she felt most free, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer had the final word. She was the author now, and she was learning how to use her voice with confidence. The people who truly saw her, who didn't try to simplify her story or turn her into a symbol, helped her see herself more clearly. They reminded her that strength can look like vulnerability, and that letting others in didn't mean letting go of her boundaries. She learned to trust herself, to trust that her instincts, her values, and her voice mattered. And little by little she began to feel whole, not in spite of what happened, but because she had chosen to grow through it. She is still healing. She probably always will be. But healing doesn't mean going back to who she was before. It means becoming someone entirely new, someone forged through fire but not consumed by it. She is more than the worst thing that ever happened to her. She is a woman who lived, who stood up, who kept going, and that is a truth more powerful than any single moment of pain. Meeting him wasn't about him. It was never about seeking his forgiveness or trying to mend something irreparably broken. It was about her, about taking a step toward the pain that had shaped her, the silence that had followed her, and the questions that had kept her up at night for years. She didn't need him to give her anything. She wasn't there for closure on his terms. She was there to face what so many people thought she should never have to confront. Her courage wasn't in the act of meeting him. It was in reclaiming control over her own story. She had spent most of her life living with an absence, the absence of her mother, the absence of answers, the absence of a past she could fully understand. That absence became a space filled with assumptions, whispers, and half-truths. She had imagined him as both monster and myth, but when she finally sat across from him, all those images crumbled. He wasn't larger than life. He was just a man, older, quieter, worn down by time. And seeing him as human didn't erase the horror of what he'd done, but it changed how she chose to carry it. There was a strange calm in the moment, not peace, not relief, but a steadiness that came from knowing she had done something for herself. She asked the questions she had rehearsed for years, knowing the answers might not come, or might not be enough. But still she asked, because it wasn't about what he would say. It was about her finally saying what she needed to say. She wasn't there to be comforted. She was there to make space for her pain, her truth, and her voice. That in itself was an act of power. He didn't cry. He didn't fall to his knees. He offered no grand gesture of remorse. But she didn't need that. She wasn't looking for him to fix anything. Nothing could undo what had been done. What she needed was to look him in the eyes and know that he no longer held power over her. The pain would always be part of her, but it no longer ruled her. She had lived with the consequences of his choices her entire life. This meeting was her choice. It was her decision to step into that space and say, "You don't get to define me anymore." After the meeting, she felt raw. Not broken, just exposed. Everything she had pushed down for so long had been pulled to the surface. But there was also relief in that exposure. No more pretending, no more wondering. She had faced it. And in that honesty there was healing. Healing that didn't erase the past, but gave her permission to move forward without needing permission from anyone else. She had confronted the ghost that haunted her and realized it couldn't control her anymore. The days that followed were quiet, reflective, emotional. She replayed the conversation, the expressions, the silences. Some of it made sense, some of it didn't, but she no longer felt like she was chasing something unreachable. She had done what she came to do, not for answers, not for him, but for herself, and with that, a certain weight lifted. She could grieve more freely, remember her mother more clearly, and begin to imagine a life that wasn't tethered to pain. She doesn't speak of that day as a victory or a resolution. She speaks of it as a turning point, a moment where she chose herself, a moment where she walked into the past not to relive it, but to reclaim her future from it. Meeting him wasn't about understanding him, it was about understanding herself, her strength, her voice, her story, and in that she found something far more powerful than closure. She found freedom. Even monsters are human, and humans are complicated. That was the hardest truth to accept. She had spent her life imagining her father as something other than human because it was easier that way, easier to hate, easier to avoid, easier to survive. But the moment she saw him, breathing, blinking, looking at her with eyes that held history and regret, the myth cracked. He wasn't some distant shadow. He was a living man, and that realization brought its own kind of pain, the kind that doesn't scream but sinks in slowly, deeply. For 20 years she lived with the weight of his actions without ever hearing his voice or seeing his face. She lived with questions that no one could answer and emotions that had no place to go. People around her tried to protect her by avoiding the subject, but silence can be its own kind of violence. It left her alone with the pieces, trying to build a sense of identity from tragedy. She became strong not because she wanted to be, but because she had no choice. And yet, strength built on survival alone can harden a person in ways even they don't see. Meeting him wasn't about forgiveness. It was about confrontation, of history, of pain, of identity. She needed to see him to understand what had haunted her for so long. She didn't expect him to explain himself in a way that would make sense, and he didn't. His words were clumsy, guarded, uncertain, but they didn't matter as much as the fact that she was there, taking up space in the story he once tried to erase. Her existence in that room was proof of her resilience. She didn't come to redeem him. She came to reclaim herself. She watched him closely, trying to see if the man who had destroyed her life showed any trace of remorse. There were flickers, moments of something behind his eyes, but she didn't hold on to them. She had long since learned that healing doesn't come from someone else's apology. It comes from deciding you deserve to heal, even without it. She saw that he was no longer the powerful figure she'd feared, just a man trying to live with what he had done, and that, strangely, gave her a sense of peace. Afterward, she sat with everything, the tension, the relief, the discomfort, the sadness. It didn't come together in a neat emotional package. There were no cinematic tears or faltering revelations, but there was a subtle shift, an opening. For the first time, she didn't feel like her story was locked behind a closed door. She had faced the source of her trauma and walked away intact, changed, yes, but not ruined, and in that small but significant way, she felt something like power. The experience didn't erase the past. It didn't make the pain go away or the grief shrink, but it helped her step out from under its shadow. She could remember her mother without imagining violence. She could imagine a future without the weight of unanswered questions. She didn't have to carry the shame of his choices anymore. That meeting didn't solve everything, but it shifted something inside her, just enough to breathe a little easier. She continues to live her life with the awareness of what happened, but not with the burden of it pressing down on her every day. She still has moments of sadness, of anger, of confusion, but they don't define her. She defines herself now through the choices she makes, the people she loves, the healing she continues to seek. Meeting him didn't give her back what she lost, but it gave her the strength to live without needing it to be returned. And that is its own kind of freedom. Healing is not a moment, it's a journey. For her, that journey began long before she ever met her father, the man who took her mother away. It was a path filled with silence, unanswered questions, and a deep, aching absence that shaped every part of her childhood. She grew up carrying a grief that felt both personal and impossible to share. The pain was there, always lurking beneath the surface, but it wasn't until much later that she realized healing wouldn't come from forgetting or pretending it never happened. It would come from facing the truth, however painful. The decision to meet him wasn't easy. It was a choice made after years of wrestling with fear, anger, and uncertainty. She didn't expect the encounter to erase the past or fix the broken pieces inside her. Instead, she hoped it would give her a chance to reclaim some control over the story that had been written for her without her consent. Meeting him was about stepping into the unknown and finding a way to stand tall in the face of a history that had defined her for too long. It was a courageous act, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. When she finally saw him, she felt a mixture of emotions: curiosity, sorrow, disbelief. The man sitting before her was not the monster she had imagined, but a flawed human being, burdened by his own regrets and mistakes. This realization didn't soften the pain, but it complicated it. She had to reconcile the person he was with the pain he caused. It was uncomfortable and raw, but in that discomfort she found space for a deeper understanding, not of him, but of herself and the power she held to decide what her life would be from that moment forward. Their conversation was not filled with grand apologies or dramatic revelations. Instead, it was marked by awkward silences and small, honest exchanges. She listened, not for answers that might never come, but to bear witness to the reality she had avoided for so long. This act of listening was an act of reclaiming her voice. It was her way of saying that her story mattered, and that she would no longer let the past control her identity or her future. After the meeting, the flood of emotions was overwhelming. She felt sadness, relief, anger, and a profound sense of release all at once. The process of healing doesn't happen overnight or in tidy packages. It is messy, complicated, and deeply personal. She learned to be patient with herself, accepting that some days would be harder than others, and that progress isn't always visible. But with each step, she grew stronger, more resilient, and more hopeful about what lay ahead. Healing also meant forgiving herself for the ways she had blamed herself or felt incomplete. It meant understanding that the tragedy she lived through did not define her worth or her future. She began to build new relationships, pursue dreams, and create a life that honored her mother's memory without being trapped by loss. This transformation was not about forgetting what happened, but about weaving it into a larger story of survival, strength, and hope. Today, she stands not as a victim of her past, but as a woman who has embraced the journey of healing with courage and grace. She knows that the scars will always be there, reminders of pain endured and battles fought. But those scars are also symbols of her resilience, her ability to face darkness and still choose light. Her journey is ongoing, and she moves forward with a heart that is both broken and whole, carrying the truth that healing is not a destination, but a lifelong path toward peace.